Today I'm going to show you how to overcome a fear that most woodworkers have. So picture this. You just finished working on a beautiful walnut slab. It's live edge, it came out great. And now you're trying to figure out a way to get some legs for it that'll make it into the perfect side table for yourself or for a client. You look around online, you see a bunch of options for steel legs, but nothing really fits the bill. And you think, how am I going to find somebody to make this for me? Well, the reality is if you've made it this far and you can actually build stuff like this in your shop or in your home garage, you can make the metal legs yourself. Welding and metalworking is so much easier than most people realize. And today I'm going to show you how, using a couple of simple tools that you probably already have and a welder that you can pick up from a big box store, you can make a beautiful set of steel legs for a live edge table like this, or really any table or any other piece of furniture that you might need. And it's going to be a lot easier than you think. So let's get right into it. So in front of me is a welding fixture table, or a platen table as a lot of people call them. This table has a 5/8 inch thick steel top with some 16 millimeter holes in it. Now you might be thinking, if I want to make table legs, I'm going to need a fixture table or some way to sort of jig up my material. Now, it'd be great if you had one of these, but chances are, if you're a woodworker in a wood shop, you don't. So today, to accomplish the assembly of these legs, we're going to use something that you almost definitely have, which is this piece of plywood. And I'll show you exactly how we're going to do it. So the way these fixture tables work is you'll set up jigs and pins and basically an alignment so that if you need to make the same shape multiple times, and in this case you're making table legs, you're probably going to have to make more than one, you would set something up on the table and then you could make a repeated shape as many times as you needed. Now again, we're not going to use the fixture table for this. We're going to use the exact same principle over on the piece of plywood to accomplish the same thing. We're going to make some small jigs out of other plywood that you could easily make in your shop with some glue and some nails. And then we're going to use that to put everything together.
So we're over on the table saw with the same 3/4 inch plywood that I picked up from Home Depot. Now I'm going to be ripping some strips so that I can make some L-shaped brackets, and those are going to be what I'm going to be clamping to. Now I ripped them on the table saw, and then I used some glue and some 18 gauge brad nails to nail up these 90-degree strips, and then we'll bring them back over into the metal shop where I have the plywood sitting on my table, and I just showed the little drawing which I got from my client for exactly what they want these legs to look like. Now these are 27 inches tall, they're 13 inches wide at the top and 11 inches wide at the base. So there is a slight taper, which obviously would add a little bit of complication to this whole thing, which is why making this jig is going to be so important.
So let's talk about the material that I'm going to use for this. Now I'm building this for a client, but I'm making the video for you. This is 3/4 by 2.5 inch solid bar. Now this alone might be intimidating if you've never worked with metal, but I'll show you how we're going to cut this up just using an angle grinder. So if you don't have an angle grinder already in your shop, you probably should. You can get them for literally 25 bucks at Harbor Freight. I'm going to be using a high quality angle grinder, but more important than the tool is the abrasive that you're going to use. If you try to do any metal cutting, especially of something thick, if you use a really inexpensive cutoff wheel, you're going to find that you really get bad results. So you don't have to invest in a good grinder, but invest in good consumables. I'm going to be using a Faired ceramic cutoff wheel. These are my favorite, and I'm not going to cut all of this with the cutoff wheel because it's kind of slow. I'll show you a couple of other options you can use along the way that also aren't that expensive. But let's make the first cut with the cutoff wheel so you can see how easy it is.
So cutting this with the angle grinder is really not difficult, but it's a little time consuming, and it's going to create a tremendous amount of dust, and that spark is a little bit of a fire risk. So in 1 minute and 30 seconds we'll cut it, but there is definitely a better way.
All right, so this is a much better alternative. Now let me just give you some advice. If you're going to do metalworking in your wood shop, think about investing in one of these bandsaws. You're going to need an angle grinder later on in this project, but cutting with a cutoff wheel like that, while it does work well, it does kind of take a while, and it makes a lot of dust and a lot of sparks. Now let me show you how much easier it is to cut with this bandsaw. Now another thing to note about portable bandsaws, portabands as they are often called. You can use them on wood, you can use them on metal. This is like, I think, 250 bucks. There's tons of options. Let me show you how fast we can cut this and how quietly and easily. Much nicer than cutting with the angle grinder. So the next two pieces need a slight angle on them, but we're gonna start by just cutting them square, and then I'm gonna show you how we can use the angle grinder to grind them in at an angle.
Okay, now I can actually start using the pieces that I made to set up this jig. Now I'm going to be using the lines as my guides, and I'm going to be checking all of my dimensions as I screw these pieces in with some 1¼ inch screws. And this is a really easy process. Now you can see how you could use this jig over and over again to make, 20 or 30 sets of these legs. In our case, we're only needing to make 2, so that'll be easy. Once I get everything lined up, I can make some more marks, and then I can continue to kind of get everything fit up, and then I can start to weld it.
So we want a little bit of an angle on the bottom of this to accommodate for this. Now, you're going to find that with welding, this isn't woodworking, right? So we don't need a perfect joint here, but it's not going to hurt us to get a little bit of a bevel on this and on this side so that we can just have that little bit better of a fit up. And then we're actually going to, once we get everything fitted up, we're actually going to grind a heavier bevel on the outside for our weld to go in. To grind this, I'm just going to be using a grinding wheel. This one in particular has holes in it, so you can see what you're doing through it. This is called a CC Grind View. This is also from Faird. This is something, if you're an amateur, this might be something worth investing in. They're not any more expensive than other grinding discs. They're incredibly fast. They're much faster than flap discs. So if you're going to be doing this for the first time, try to buy, like I said, good abrasives. Let's grind this bevel real quick. Just a real light. Doesn't have to be perfect at all because we're going to fill that in with some weld.
Grinding in this bevel is actually not that big of a deal. And on the other one of these legs that I had to make, I just cut the bar a little bit shorter. You can see the way this grinding disc works, though. It really eats metal very quickly. And it's great, especially if you're a beginner, so you're saving a lot of time.
All right, so you're probably looking at this thinking, how am I going to weld this really thick material? So what we're going to do now is, now that everything is situated and we know that our jig is good, I've been checking the measurements, everything is nice and square and exactly what I want. Now, anything we do to bevel this material, it's not going to matter because we're still going to be able to clamp it to the wood. So you could shorten this. The nice thing about metalworking is you can fill gaps. So now we're using a relatively small welder on this, and I'm going to be using it on the 110 power setting under the assumption that you might not have 220. So I'm going to show you what parts of this metal we're going to bevel, and then we're going to clamp everything up, tack weld it, and finish weld it with flux core wire without any gas.
Now, grinding in these weld bevels is super important. You want to make sure you have a lot of room there for the weld to penetrate, especially on this really thick material.
So let's talk about clamping of this. Now, we could easily use F-clamps like this. Every wood shop has these. These are going to do the job just fine. If anything, they're going to be a little more, maybe a little more reliable. But if you're going to do any amount of metalworking, grab yourself some of these C-style vice grip style welding clamps. They're very inexpensive. You can get a whole pack of them on Amazon real cheap. I'll put a link down in the description. These are just good to have anyway, but they're really, really fast. You can get everything kind of lined up, and this is going to make things faster. Let's talk about the welder we're going to use for this. Now, I mentioned in the beginning of the video that you could buy this welder at the big box store. This is a Lincoln Electric Weld Pack 180 MP. The MP stands for multi-process. So this machine can do MIG, TIG, stick, and flux core. This is a great entry-level machine, partially because it's dual voltage. So you can run it on 220 with this plug, or you can put this converter on it and it will run on 110. Now, the machine will automatically sense how much current it's getting, how much voltage, and it will adjust its abilities based on that. So inside the machine, I'm going to be running a flux core wire on this. Now, I've done a bunch of videos about sort of welding for woodworkers and intro to welding and the differences in different welding, and I'll put links to all those down below. But with flux core welding, we're not going to need any gas, and I know that's a barrier to entry for a lot of people that want to get into welding. Is they're like, oh, I got to find a welding distributor and get a gas bottle. You can literally just go to Home Depot, buy this machine. It comes with a small spool of flux core wire, but you could buy a roll of wire from Home Depot at the same time, and you could come back home, plug it in, and start welding obviously with the correct PPE. So inside the machine is going to give you all your settings. I've done other videos on this. I'm not going to go into that. But the key point here is I'm going to be using this on 110, just because I know that's what most people are going to have in their shop. And I'm going to be using flux core, so no gas. So something to note about welding with flux core wire is that you're going to want to be in a well-ventilated area. Now, in my case, because I'm in my welding shop, even though I'm using the plywood, I've got a fume extractor that's going to suck up all that smoke. Now, if you're doing this in your home shop or your garage, you're going to want to have some cross air. You're going to want to have like a fan behind you that's pushing that smoke maybe out the door, or you could actually do this welding outside. If you can't do this outside, be really careful and make sure that you don't breathe in too much of this, because the smoke from this can make you kind of sick. So be careful, be in a well-ventilated area. That is one of the downsides to using a flux core wire versus using a hard wire with gas, is that you're burning off that flux. So just be safe, read the manuals, and make sure you have some air passing over. You'll see how smoky this is when I actually do the welding. All right, so you might immediately be thinking you're out of your mind for welding on this plywood. Now, the reality is the flash point of the plywood is actually pretty high. And we're gonna make sure that we have some water and a fire extinguisher nearby, so that if we do get a small fire, we can just sort of blot it out. Now, obviously be careful, and when we go to fully weld this, we are gonna take it off the plywood and we're gonna sort of suspend it in space so that we aren't concentrating so much heat on the wood. But tack welding on plywood is totally fine. Just be careful and keep some water nearby. And obviously when you're done for the day, don't do a bunch of welding and then leave this in your shop smoldering so that it burns your house down. Be careful.
Okay, let's get this thing tacked up and then welded. I'm gonna throw a couple of quick tacks in the corners, and then I'm actually gonna take it out of the jig so it's easier to access and so I don't completely melt and burn this piece of plywood. Now, because I'm flux core welding, I'm actually gonna be dragging my MIG gun as I weld, and I'm gonna be using a wire brush to knock off some of the slag and some of the kind of dirt on it after the weld. Now, I actually undercut a little bit when I was doing some of this welding, which means my machine was set up a little bit too hot. And while I'm not going to be talking too much about welding technique in this video, there are tons of great videos online, especially from my friend Jody, the weld monger, who can show you exactly how to weld properly. And, you know, you can easily learn this process.
All right, so we've welded up a leg, all flux core welded. It's still pretty hot. Now you might be wondering, can this weld really be strong? Because of those bevels and because we had this machine set pretty much as high as it will go, the penetration amount on this is definitely going to be enough for like a furniture piece. Now, would I build a bridge with this method? Probably not. And under static loads, right? It's a table, it's a static load. There's no, moving forces against it. I am very confident this is going to last. Also, everything is in compression here, right? So my top and my bottom are sandwiching these two sides. So there's really no need for anything to move unless it gets really hit with a diagonal super hard load. So set your machine correctly, but bevel your material, and you can actually get a lot more out of a small machine. Again, I'm running on 110 volts here, so I'm not using the full capacity and full potential of this machine. Let's grind this piece up and get it nice and clean before I make the next leg.
So grinding of these welds is actually super critical if you want to get a really clean and professional looking set of legs. Now in this case, I'm actually using a flap disc, and basically all I'm doing here is grinding away all of the excess weld that's sticking up off of the surface from that last process. Now that's why the beveling is actually really important. Because if we were to just have two flat pieces of metal the same way you would have a woodworking joint, and we ground away the weld, there would be nothing left holding the joint together. So because we want a flat and uniform surface, we want the weld to penetrate and sit down below the actual surface so that when we grind away the top section, we're leaving plenty of mass and material inside the actual valley of the weld. Now you can see the technique I'm doing here where I have little tiny kind of holes in my weld, and I'm just sort of filling them in. I turned the voltage on my welder down so it's not going to penetrate as deep, and these little welds are really just superficial to make this thing look nice and clean. Now, I'll be honest, you could definitely get a much better and cleaner result if you were to use actual MIG welding, which was where you would have a C25 gas, and I've done a whole video about the difference between flux core welding and MIG welding. MIG welding with hard wire, you would absolutely get a better result, and you'd have a lot less porosity and a lot less of these little areas that you have to go back and touch up with the welder. Either way though, with a little bit of patience, you can get really good results even with a 110 volt flux core welder on this really thick material. It's all about how patient you are as you're doing your fit up and your prep and your finish. Now with the legs actually ground, I can go ahead and I can cut the mounting brackets that I'm going to be using to mount these to the bottom of the slab. This is just some 1/4 inch thick material, and I'm just taking a regular hand drill and I'm punching some 1/4 inch holes in this material so that I can run some screws through them into the bottom of the slab with a little bit of slack so that the slab can ebb and flow and move. Now again, I'm doing this with the simplest tools possible. I've got tons of other ways that I could be drilling holes in this metal, but I thought if you're a woodworker, you probably have a drill, so I can show you exactly how to drill that. And I've got a few videos on my channel showing how to drill holes in metal, so you should check those out if you're trying to figure out how you can actually pop holes in metal with just regular drill bits that you probably already have. Now I'm just marking out where these mounting brackets go, getting everything nice and square and nice, and then I'm going to go ahead and tack them in place. Once they're tacked in place, I'm going to actually lift this thing up off the table and actually do some welding on the front and back side. But first, I'm going to weld the front side, and I have those clamps to try to avoid any warping. When you weld thin material to thick material, it's almost a guarantee that the thin material is going to warp, and it typically warps towards the heat. So it'll bend in towards this weld. That's why I'm hitting these things with a hammer to try to get them nice and flat and straight. Now I'm just welding a little bit on the back side because this is how this table is going to be secured to these legs. So I want to make sure that the mount is very strong. And this is a pretty easy little fillet weld that I go in there and do. Cleaning everything up with the wire brush.
All right, so the first table leg is done. It's all welded up. It still needs a little bit of finishing on the grinding side before it could be painted. But for the most part, it is ready to go. I ground out those bottoms like you saw. And because I actually forgot these top corners will be exposed, I'm going to have to grind and dress these as well and just make sure everything's flat and flush before it goes for paint, because the paint will reveal a lot of those little puck marks and holes. Now you can use what's called glazing putty, which is typically used in body work if you want to get a really perfect finish and you can't get a great grind out of it. Or you could just use Bondo if you want to have that really perfect, totally smooth finish. Now, I try to avoid any stuff like that, but it's no different than really kind of like using wood filler if you're a woodworker. So it's acceptable. Don't let anybody tell you that it isn't. Let's make the second one. You'll see how I use the jig. I'm going to blaze through that one in the video because you don't need to watch me do all that twice, and I'll give you some tips along the way.
So making the second one is the exact same process. Now I'm here going to skip the angle grinder and go right to the bandsaw, and I'm just chopping up these pieces. In this case, I made them actually a tiny bit shorter than I did the first time, and that's because it would allow me to have actually less of a bevel, and it would allow me to fit in the jig that much better. Now, the key here is that the jig is going to maintain these to be the exact same size, even if you cut your material wrong. That's the beautiful part about metalworking and welding, is that the accuracy of your cuts is so much more forgiving than if you were to do woodworking. Because if I were to do this woodworking, I would need these joints to be absolutely perfect. And if everything was already set up and I had already maybe finished or started working on a piece of, let's call it walnut, and I cut it too short, then it would completely be ruined. In this case, you can cut a piece of metal probably a ½ inch too short, which would be extreme but doable, and you could go ahead and weld it, and it would actually just fill in that gap and be one homogeneous piece of metal when you're done. So I'm going through the same process here where I'm kind of welding a little bit and then grinding to make sure everything is nice and smooth. And again, I'm just using my plywood table, even though I happen to be sitting on my nice welding table. Now, you really got to watch the sparks and dust when you're doing this type of work, because the dust that's getting in the air from using the flap disc is definitely palpable. But, you want to just clean up after you're done and try to keep that dust from getting up into the airstream as you're sort of walking around your shop. I have a fume extractor running while I do this welding because the gases that come off of the flux core welding can actually be pretty harmful and can make you kind of sick. So I'm making sure that all of those gases go up and into the fume hood so that doesn't actually, make me sick or affect me in any way. a couple more welds on these braces on the back side. You can see the way that flux core weld works, where you have the slag at first and you wipe it off with a wire brush. And now I'm just grinding all my corners, making sure everything's looking nice and square. The other thing I'm doing here is I'm taking an actual orbital sander and I'm trying to clean up some of the little weld BBs that are on there. And now I'm taking a Fared Polyvlies curved front finishing disc, and I'm just sort of brightening up and cleaning up the welds on the inside corner, because I'm going to leave those and paint over them, and I want them to look nice. Now I like to use this self-etching primer, especially when I'm painting a raw steel. So I shook up a can of that and got it coated on there. Missed a few spots, but I am absolutely not a painter. I just promised the client that I would paint these for him. Now I'm shaking up some satin black Rust-Oleum oil-based paint. This is a couple of days later, and just giving this a quick spray down so that it can be done and it can be off my list. I gave those legs 2 days to dry, and then you can see the walnut slab again flipped over on the workbench. And that set of legs you see in the background are actually the original legs that this slab came with. The person that I'm doing this for had those legs made and then realized they were a little bit too low because he wants to use this as a table. So that's why I made the legs that were in this video. And this is a beautiful, almost 2-inch thick walnut slab. And these are what the legs look like before I installed them. And here is the table all finished. This turned out really beautiful, and I'm super happy with the result.
All right, so we're done. Now, I understand that this might seem really intimidating, but honestly, aside from kind of getting the hang of the welding, all of the processes that I did in there are really kind of adjacent to any woodworking process you've probably already done. Now, metalworking is a lot dirtier. It's a little more dangerous, I guess, because you could burn yourself, but you could also cut your hand off on the table saw. So if you're comfortable using power tools, you probably are comfortable using a welder. One of the things I do want to stress, though, is that you want to be in a well-ventilated environment if you're going to use a flux core welder like that, because you don't want to breathe in that smoke from the flux core process of welding. Now, I have a fume extractor that I was running to evacuate that smoke, but overall, the process is the same. You just want a cross breeze, get that smoke out of your face. So yeah, try this out. It's a great process. It's a really important and valuable skill to learn, and you can create a beautiful result. I didn't do anything special. I just cut up the metal, stuck it together with the welder, and made these beautiful table legs for this really gorgeous walnut slab. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have questions, leave them down below, and there'll be links to all the tools I use, including the welder, in the description. So check that out, and I'll see you on the next one.